In this video, we'll be talking about variables, which you will use throughout your VBA code to store data, and we will cover the various types of variables that you might use. To start, we first have to understand what variables are. Variables are named items that you assign a specific value to that are then stored in your computer's memory or storage system. After assigning a value to a variable, you can later pull the value out of that variable and use it to execute actions in your code. Generally speaking, it's best practice to declare your variables, which means to name and describe them, at the top of your code rather than mixing them in throughout your code in case you need to go back and change something later. There are also a few rules to keep in mind when naming your variables. First, the name can't exceed 255 characters, which should never happen anyways. Typically, you want your variable name to be clear and concise. Second, you can't include any spaces or periods in your variable names. Spaces and periods are identifiers that VBA uses to either separate out the words into separate actions or to move a step deeper into the action you are describing, which will make more sense when we talk about the details of VBA later. Your names also can't start with a number and can't be a word that VBA already has an action or feature assigned to. For example, if we look at the valid names, favorite underscore color would be a valid variable name because it uses an underscore in the place of the period that we see on the right under invalid names. At the second line, username is invalid when it has a space in between the two words, but is a valid name when we remove that space and make it all one variable. Ninth value starts with a number, which makes it an invalid variable name. But if we flip that around and you say value 9 instead, it becomes valid. Lastly, type is a word in VBA that is used to declare data types for various items. Because type has an action and feature already associated with it, we can't use type as a variable name. However, if we change that up a little bit and we put an X or something in front of the word type, it becomes a valid variable name. So now that we understand a little bit more about what variables are, we can talk about the different types of variables we would use throughout our code. Variable types generally fall into one of two categories. The first is numeric, which stores number-based data, and the second is non-numeric, which stores everything else. The variable types listed in bold are the types you will probably use most often. First, let's look at the numeric data types. Bytes are rarely used because they can only store small and positive numbers. You might occasionally see a long variable type because it can store much larger positive numbers, but most often you will see numbers fall into either integer, single, or double. Integer is, as it sounds, capable of storing whole number values. Single and double both store numbers that might have negative or have decimal values, so these are the two you will see most often. Currency ensures you will be using exact numbers for calculation instead of risking rounded numbers, so it's a good variable type to use for exact monetary calculations. Let's talk for a little bit about why it's important to use the correct variable type. If we store data as an integer, for example, and say we store the number 9, later in our code, if we divide that variable by 2, which would result in the value 4.5, the decimal won't actually be stored into the system because it's expecting an integer type value, thus a whole number. This introduces error and inaccuracy into our calculations, so it's important to pay attention to the variable type. Now let's look at the non-numeric types. String and Boolean you will use often. String stores text values, so messages or words that you want to build or display to the user would be string type variables. Boolean stores binary data, so true or false, yes or no, 0 or 1, are all examples of binary data. The date type can store dates and times, but the formatting is a little strange, so unless you're calculating dates and times, it might be best to store your dates as string variables however you want to format them. Object variables store object addresses, which we'll talk about in the details of coding VBA. Variant types are the default type of variable in VBA. If you don't explicitly declare your variable type, but rather let VBA determine the variable type for you, it will assign a variant type variable. This is a variable type that will actually change its type to accept whatever type of data you're trying to store in it. While this sounds like a good thing at first, it's actually highly inefficient and can slow down your code significantly. So it's best to declare your variable type to fit what you are actually using. In summary, we've learned that variables store values in the computer memory for us to use later on in our code. We have to be careful when naming our variables to avoid things like spaces and periods to ensure the name is valid. And we need to be careful when assigning variable types to ensure our data and code execution is accurate and consistent. Now that we understand the idea of variables, we can start to use them in our code.